here tonight thinking that we just need to try a little bit harder to be a better husband. I just need to try a little bit harder to be a better wife. Setting your heart and mind on the redemption that is yours because of Jesus Christ and walking by faith in the freedom you have to live as God's children, to live as one flesh with your spouse, away from the sinfulness of the world, that's the only way. Reckoning ourselves dead indeed unto sin and alive unto God, praying earnestly for God's grace and power to make me one with my spouse, that's the key. It's not just trying harder. It's a reliance on the grace of God. It's trusting His grace to make this possible. Because if you think about it in human terms, two becoming one is an impossibility. But with God, all things are possible. To live by grace is to realize God's favor is upon your marriage. You ever consider it that way? God's favor is upon your marriage. God cares about your marriage. He cares about my marriage. He wants me, He wants my spouse to become one. It's His desire. And He has given the tools in the Word of God to model the oneness. But it comes by actively humbling ourselves first under God's mighty hand and submitting ourselves to one another. Granted, I want to point out something. That is actually sometimes harder for some more than others, right? Some people are just wired differently. Some people's DNA makes it a lot harder for them to put themselves under. That's because they're sin-tainted in all DNA. But some of us, it's actually harder than other people. Some people, because not just of their DNA, but their habits, their upbringing, the things that they have done throughout their life or others have done to them, makes it harder to submit to God and to one another. But don't give up, because it is a worthy cause. It's mentioned over and over again. It is the expectation God has in marriage for two to become one flesh. Now, so here's the ideal, two becoming one. The problem, sin. Why work at it? Is there a cause to all this? Is there some reason for this besides just being able to walk hand in hand with my wife when we're 79, 82 years old, whatever, along the beach picking up seashells? Is that the reason for living as one flesh so that we can have a pleasant life? That's good. That's nice. But I believe there's a cause far greater than that. Because in Ephesians chapter 5, verse 31, which we just read, the next verse he says, "This is a great mystery, but I speak concerning Christ and the church." So there is a cause that's greater than just my comfort, my happiness, my peace, a home where the neighbors don't think we're always fighting. There's something more important than that, and that is the gospel of Jesus Christ. Consider it this way. A healthy marriage, one where there's two becoming one, not two that are one, two becoming one, is one that greatly reflects the unity of Christ and His church. One that is the opportunity to witness to the neighbors, to witness to the kids. Don't just consider the kids will cry when we fight, or the neighbors might hear us. Consider that the kids and the neighbors will learn of Christ by what they see and hear in the marriage. Consider that. That's a little bit more important cause. The goal of the church is to so reverence and respect Christ that those who see the church cannot distinguish between Christ's glory and the individuals in the church. In other words, there's an old song that says, "I saw Jesus in you." That's the concept there. The intent of the church is for the glory of God to be seen through the people, the fallible people of the church, because they're submitting and reverencing and respecting Christ. The goal of the church is for those looking on to marvel that even though they've never met Jesus, they've seen the closest thing they can to Him in the church, in the people. And so the cause of becoming one flesh is greater than a healthy, happy life lived in solitude with your hand in your spouses strolling along the beach at retirement. That sounds nice, but I want more than nice. I want something for the glory of God. I want people to see Bonnie and I and our relationship with one another and say, "I don't know God, but after knowing them, I want to." That's what I hope. Still got the problem of sin. That's why we need the grace of God. I want our children to grow up saying, "Mom and Dad had their failures, boy did they, but I learned much of the forgiveness of Christ from them. I learned much of what it meant to unconditionally love from them. I learned much of what it meant to unconditionally respect because of them. I learned much of Christ from them." So the cause of two becoming one flesh is a great cause. It is God's glory in His church That is the cause of a relentless pursuit by the grace of God of two becoming one flesh in the covenant of marriage. That should cause us to think differently about marriage. That's not the way the world thinks about marriage. Even good marriages in the world have a selfish background to them. They have a selfish backdrop in that, well, I want to get along with my wife now so that we'll have pleasant time later. But only the Christian can say, I want to have a right relationship with my wife, my spouse now, so that God will be glorified, so that people will be saved, so the gospel will be proclaimed by a couple. Did you think about that? We can witness, married people can witness in a fashion that unmarried people can't. Now, we can all share the gospel with our words, but unmarried people can't witness, can't share the gospel with their married life. But married couples can. That's a benefit. That's a blessing. That's a responsibility. Because at the same time, married people have the opportunity to bring great cursing upon Christ because of their marriage, or lack of grace of God in it. So, in just finishing up here, I'm not going to speak long. I want to get some practical instruction for married couples. For all of us. This is for me. It's not just me saying these things because I've got it figured out and now time for me to impart this to you. That's not it at all. We are all in the process of two becoming one flesh. So instruction in two parts. I say two parts because man is made up of the two-part being. Becoming one flesh in the flesh sense, in the physical sense, and becoming one flesh in the spiritual sense. Talk about those two things and that's it. Some practical instruction. I know that all of you, most of you, have heard these things before, but I want to remind us of it. It's a good reminder for me, a good reminder for all of us. First of all, in speaking of becoming one flesh in the physical sense, the physical union, the material. Now that has two parts to it. And a lot of times when people talk about the physical union, automatically they're thinking in sexual terms. That's not what I want to first of all talk about. The Bible addresses both, by the way. But primarily physical oneness, physical union in the non-sexual sense is basically the husband giving his life, his body for his wife, and the wife reverencing her husband unconditionally. So look at those two aspects, the husband's practice. Ephesians 5, this same passage, verse 25 says, "Husbands, love your wives, even as Christ also loved the church and gave himself, his flesh, for it." Isn't that what Christ did for the church? Gave his flesh for her. Verse 29, or verse 28, "So ought men to love their wives as their own bodies." He's talking about flesh there, their own bodies. Verse 29, "For no man ever yet hated his own flesh, but nourisheth and cherisheth it, even as the Lord the church." The emphasis of the husband's responsibility in Ephesians chapter 5 is an actual, practical giving of your literal flesh for your wife. I put it down this way and was reading this to my wife to see what she thought about it. I do that sometimes so she can correct me. Husband needs to be willing to give his skin for his wife. And not just be willing, he ought to do it on a daily basis. Now, this is not the practical instruction. This is just an example. Because I think that every man here would do this. But the concept of, it's an old illustration. Somebody might use it to show how much they care for somebody. Say, "I'd take a bullet for you." Literally, husbands willing to take a bullet, to damage their flesh for the sake of their wife. That's the idea. He's talking about being willing to forego the pleasures, being willing to forego the comforts of our own flesh for our wife's well-being. Even for her fleshly well-being, her body. Being willing to sacrifice that and then doing it on a regular basis. So, a way to think about this, we hear this description of a bond of marriage and the oneness of the covenantal relationship, and we notice the concept of self-sacrifice. So our wife nudges us and says, "We haven't had a date in quite some time." So we think about it and decide that we love our wife so we can sacrifice some of our time, our flesh, to work on becoming one. So we tell her, Friday is going to be date night and be ready for a wonderful evening. She dresses up, arranges a babysitter, makes sure there's enough food for the kids, has a list of 4 numbers to call in an emergency, gets all ready to go out. We're usually watching TV waiting for her, by the way, to get ready. And we get in the car, and guys, we drive her down to watch the monster trucks at the ESA. we're going to take her on date night.